Hi everyone, Macsen here. Welcome to my latest Pillars of Eternity, the White March min-max character creation guide. In this video, I'm going to be taking a look at a bit of an unconventional build. It's a frontline or tank build that uses the rogue class. Now that's something that you wouldn't normally use as a frontline build. You'd normally use something like a paladin, a fighter, a monk, or perhaps a barbarian in those type of roles. But you can actually use the rogue, and there's a way that you can actually make it into a very good character build, and that's the build I'm going to be showing you in this video. Now when you get to level 5, there's a particular skill that is very useful for this build, and it kind of centers around this skill, this character build. I'm going to be showing attributes that I would pick for this build a bit later on. But the ability that I'm talking about is Riposte, which is the name of the build. So what Riposte does, the rogue looks for openings to counter-attack in combat. Incoming melee attacks that target deflection and miss have a chance of allowing an instant full attack riposte. Only active with melee weapons equipped, and it's a passive ability. So it doesn't actually mention all the details here, but I'll mention more about that after I've shown you the character creation setup and we get back to picking abilities and talents. But what this ability does is basically it's very good for frontline builds, because they're the builds that are going to be targeted the most in combat. They're the ones that are going to be using deflection the most. And if you have high amounts of deflection with a character, you can actually make use out of this much more often and get free attacks, free full attack riposte attacks. So a full attack, of course, is using every weapon that you have in your hands at that time. So if you have one weapon, you'd use just one weapon. If you had two weapons, you'd use both weapons. So let's actually take a look at the character creation setup for this build. So this is my Riposte rogue. It has very specific stats and attributes, and I've minimized and maximized them for very specific reasons. It may look a bit peculiar to you now, perhaps some of these, but I'll be mentioning in great detail why I've selected certain things during the course of this video. Before I do that though, I should mention the rogue's starting ability and basic stats, because they're of course very important. I have actually covered the rogue before. I've done a character creation video for a much more conventional type of rogue. I recommend you check out if you just want to make a more conventional rogue. It is a bit out of date though. It was done before the White March came out, so attributes and skills and certain abilities and talents have been added to the rogue class since. I will mention during the course of this video those things that have been changed though, if you want to check out that previous video and know what's changed since. So let's start out with the starting ability of the rogue. So the sneak attack actually does a lot of extra damage to your opponents, 50% actually if it's afflicted by any of these afflictions or within the first couple of seconds of combat. Now this is still very useful for a frontline riposte rogue. It means that your frontline rogue will actually do a lot of damage, probably a lot more than many other type of frontline class builds, which normally basically are there to soak up damage or just avoid damage altogether. This will actually hopefully do both pretty well. So that's a very useful ability still for this actual rogue, and I'm going to be making use out of that as much as possible. The skills that the rogue starts with, of course, is a point in stealth and a couple of points in mechanics. This is very good for a frontline build still as well. The stealth means that you will be detected less, which frontline builds actually usually need a bit of points in stealth in my opinion. And the rogue, of course, actually has the most mechanics of any class within the game, and we're going to be wanting to make use out of that still. That's why I would recommend you pick Drifter as your starting background, which adds an extra point in both of those. There isn't any way to add a couple of points in those actual skills though, like there is with some backgrounds like colonist for a couple of points with survival for instance. Investing highly into stealth and mechanics will mean that your rogue is great for scouting, and it's actually very useful for finding traps within dungeons as well if you have high levels of stealth and mechanics. Also, I'd recommend you have a high level of might with your riposte rogue, and that's going to help out with your traps as well, setting traps which make use of the might ability. So yeah, staying with those skills is a very good idea. although you probably will want to invest a certain amount of points into survival and athletics as well. I'll mention more about that later on though. So the actual starting stats, your endurance, your health, accuracy and deflection, to be honest, they're not very good for a frontline build, especially the endurance, health and deflection. Accuracy is the best in the starting amount within the game though. Increasing our deflection is really key to this character build. Not only will it mean it functions a lot better in its frontline role, so it's basically avoiding attacks, but it will also mean that we trigger the riposte ability a lot more frequently. When opponents miss us, of course, we get 3 extra attacks, and hopefully a significant amount of those attacks will make use out of the sneak attack to basically do extra damage, and of course they are full attacks, so we use both weapons that the rogues happen to use. So we could do a lot of extra damage and avoid a lot of damage. Now, as I mentioned, there's a huge amount of variety of ways you can increase deflection. The most obvious way to increase deflection, of course, is to increase your resolve. You get an extra deflection there. So I've maximized our resolve, adding an extra 10, which is the most you can do to start out with anyway. So we've got an extra 10 deflection by doing that. Now that's only 25. A fighter would still have more deflection. They would have 30 than us. But there's many more ways you can increase it. So you can use a variety of extra equipment. You can use shields. Hatchet gives deflection. There's a variety of rings you can find during the game that give extra deflection, for example, and cloaks and all sorts of different ways. And there's also ways you can increase your resolve as well, which of course will give you extra deflection. You can get higher resolve than 20. You can get much more high than that. So that will increase deflection, which is going to be great for this character. There's potions. There's a huge amount of potions that actually give you extra deflection. They are only over a certain period of time, but they're definitely worthwhile using for the trickier combats. And there are ways, of course, that you can increase the duration of those potions. For example, camping and certain survival bonuses that are now available since the White March expansion. Actually having certain companions within your party is a great way to increase deflection as well. A variety of companions can do that. The most notable one is the Paladin. They actually have a couple of ways at least of increasing deflection. The first being the talent Inspiring Triumph, which increases your defenses, including deflection, I believe, if they kill an opponent. There's Reinforcing Exhortation, which is a ability that increases deflection. And there's a specific type of paladin, the Shield Bearers of Saint Elka. They actually have a couple of talents which increase deflection as well. So they would be great in your party if you have a riposte row. There's also the Fighter. They actually have a talent called Guardian, which actually increases deflection to allies within a certain area. There's also a Priest. They actually have a way to increase defenses and deflection. They have a couple of spells which do both of those. So there's at least 3 different types of party members that you can have within your party to help out increase deflection, not only for your riposte rogue but for other party members as well. So all in all, you can really get your levels of deflection up to significant amounts, to the point where you're doing riposte attacks much more often and avoiding attacks pretty much totally. So yeah, there's a lot of ways you can do that. So I should mention attributes now, but before I do that, I didn't mention culture, did I? Culture I've actually selected is Adir, and the reason why I've selected that is to gain an extra point in resolve. You could actually pick Ixomital Plains, which does exactly the same thing. You can actually pick Drifter with Ixomital Plains as well as Adir. So it doesn't really matter which one you pick, whichever one you like really. Both of those give the desired outcome. Now the other attributes, I should mention here why I've minimized and maximized these. The first I should mention is intellect. Now I'd really recommend that you minimize intellect so you have extra points to spend elsewhere. The reason why I say that is because it's just not all that useful for a riposte rogue. First of all, rogues in general don't make use out of air effects. They don't have any abilities that do that, I believe. You can actually use scrolls potentially with a rogue, of course, but you probably wouldn't want to in many circumstances, arguably. At least not with this build, anyway. So you don't need it for that. Duration, it does have an effect, though. So your duration type abilities are going to be reduced, the amount of time they work for. That is a downside, but it's an acceptable downside. You really need the attribute points in other areas. We won't actually be picking too many abilities that make use of that duration because of the lack of intellect. Now, the other 4 attributes are open to debate how much you should invest in my opinion. These 2 I'd minimize and maximize definitely. The others is not so much definite. Now, might, the reason why I'm maximizing might is because, well, I want to do as much damage as possible for a start. The full riposte attacks actually make use of a might, of course. So every time you do one of those, if you maximize your might, you do the maximum damage. There are ways you can heal your rogue, of course. So the new athletic second wind ability that will make use of the extra might. And also there's a talent that you could actually pick which would use its might as well to heal. So there's a variety of reasons why having a good might value is good for that. Constitution is important for every frontline build basically, so you're going to want to have a lot of that. Now if you can get your deflection up to so high levels where you're not getting a hit at all, arguably you could lower your constitution and put it into other areas. I have actually maximized that as much as I could here though, but it would be nice to maybe take a few points off this and stick this elsewhere. Now the last 2 remaining attributes are still very important to the rogue, the riposte rogue. So perception allows you to interact more often and of course gives you accuracy. So I've invested highly into that, not quite enough to maximize it, but still a very large amount. Now the other stat which I've minimized here is dexterity, and this is a big downside actually in doing this. It means you're not going to be doing attacks as quickly as you could be doing. And even though this is a frontline build, because it's a rogue, we really want to do attacks as quickly as possible, do as much damage as quickly as possible. So this is a big sacrifice really. There are ways you can increase your speed of attacks though. There are weapons that give you extra attack speed and other ways you can increase your attack speed. One thing I should point out though, which is very important, is that the riposte ability doesn't actually require dexterity. It's automatic, it's a passive ability. So whenever your opponent's missed, there's a chance that you will actually do a riposte attack. Now something which I should mention that's very key is it's not 100%, it doesn't actually work every single time. In fact, it's only 20% of the time when an opponent misses that you will do a riposte attack. So it's not some massively overpowered ability. So if there are ways that you can actually increase your dexterity to attack more often, I do recommend you do so. You may want to actually retrain your rogue at some point. If you've got a lot of accuracy, you may want to lower your perception a bit. And if you have ways that you've been able to increase your deflection to a huge amount, you may want to take a few points out of constitution, maybe even a lot of points out of constitution, and that way you could retrain your character to have a lot more dexterity, something like that perhaps. You could potentially even take a bit out of might, but I'd be less inclined to do that. So that's maybe the attributes that you might want with your riposte rogue towards the end of the game. You could actually retrain it to something like that. The starting ability that I recommend you choose with your riposte rogue is Blinding Strike. I think it's got a slight edge over Crippling Strike. Basically, Blinding Strike gives you a affliction against the opponent you use it against. It's only 1 per encounter, which is a downside compared to Crippling Strike, but it's a much better affliction. Both of these work to trigger your sneak attack. But blinded means that your opponent is much less likely to hit you, which of course will mean that you have more chance of being able to enable the riposte strike ability, and also, well, since you're a frontline build, not getting hit in the first place is going to be great for you. Crippling Strike is probably more useful for more conventional types of rogues in my opinion, especially ones that mainly focus on using ranged attacks. It is still a pretty good idea actually to start out combat with a ranged attack with your riposte rogue, but I'll mention more about weapon choices a bit later on. And lastly, before I get to skills and abilities, I should mention the race selection that I've chosen for the riposte rogue. It's actually a human, which is a race I wouldn't actually pick all that often. The reason why I've picked human in this case mainly is due to the extra point in resolve. There's only actually a couple of races that actually give you an extra point in resolve. The extra point in might is also very useful. The actual ability you get with humans will come in handy every now and then. Especially if you have less constitution. So basically what happens is, once per encounter, 5 seconds after being reduced below 50% endurance, you gain an accuracy boost and a damage boost. Now this is sadly affected by your intelligence. So at 3 intelligence, I believe it lasts 13 seconds instead of the normal 20 seconds. So this won't be as good as it could be with higher intelligence, but I still think it's a pretty useful ability in that circumstance. The other races which you may want to consider with a riposte rogue is probably the Orlan. They're the only other race that gives an extra point into resolve. Sadly though, it does have a minus to might, which you're probably going to want to maximize. But the Wild Orlan is pretty decent though, that bonus. So if you're subjected to a will attack, you gain extra defenses. Since your riposte rogue has a low intelligence, you're actually not brilliant at will defense. Resolve though does make up for that a bit, maximizing that out. You get a huge bonus to will there, and I believe that would be minus 14. So will's not amazing, but it's not utterly dreadful. So back to skills, talents and abilities. I'm actually going to discuss skills last after I've leveled up my character, so I don't have to spend the points each time. It's not something you'd normally do, of course, but for this video's sake I will. So the first talent I'm actually going to pick is weapon and shield style. Now you'd basically pick this for almost every frontline build. The extra deflection and the extra reflex is just so useful that you're going to want to pick it in most circumstances. There are downsides, of course, and I'll mention a bit more about that later on, but that's going to be the first talent I'm going to pick with the riposte rogue. So the first ability, we alternate between talents and abilities, of course. The first ability I'm going to pick is Dirty Fighting, I believe. You could pick Reckless Assault at this stage, but I actually want to talk a bit about that talent ability, I should say. It's debatable whether or not you should pick it. Crippling Strike and Escape I'm not going to be picking with the riposte rogue. This is okay, of course, but the lack of duration because of intelligence lowers its usefulness, and it's not so useful for a frontline build anyway, in my opinion. Escape isn't so useful for this character. There are better ways to move around your riposte rogue, in my opinion. We actually want to be engaging opponents most of the time anyway with a frontline character build. So for now I'm going to take Dirty Fighting, which will convert 10% of hits to crits. We want to be doing a lot of damage still, even though this is a frontline build. So the next talent, now I'm going to pick another defensive talent at this stage, and you may be thinking that I might pick Cautious Attack. I'm not. I believe the minus 20% to attack speed is too big a negative in this circumstance. 8 Deflection just isn't enough for me, in my opinion. It's a bit debatable. This would of course help the riposte ability, which we're going to be picking up next level, but we still want to be doing the conventional attacks a certain amount, and we wouldn't be doing very many at all with a minus 20% to attack speed. We want to be finding ways to increase that rather than minus it, really. So the talent I'm actually going to be picking is Hold the Line. We want to engage a certain amount of opponents, and this will help with that. So we won't get the negative for being flanked so much, which minuses our deflection by 10. There are actually further bonuses that come from this as well, which you'll see later on. I'll be mentioning what exactly. So that's the pick that I'd make at this stage. So the next ability we're going to pick here, the Ability that I've really centered this build around is Riposte. So I've mentioned a bit about this before. Only 20% of the attacks that miss will actually be riposted by us, but they will be full attacks. Now the fact that we're using a shield means that you'd think we'd only be doing attacks of one weapon, but there are actually shields in the game that count as weapons, and one of those shields is the ladder door, which you can see here. What this does is give you a huge amount of extra deflection and actually counts as a weapon, so it does crush attacks. You alternate between your right hand and the ladder door for conventional attacks, but with the riposte attack you do attacks with both, so that's a very useful item that you'll be wanting to pick up early on, especially with the riposte rogue. The riposte ability is definitely not an overpowered ability at all. If it happened more often than 20%, say 50%, then it could be pretty overpowered potentially. It would be nice if it was maybe 25%, for example, but I think it's a very good ability if not overpowered, and it works very well with this build, so that's the pick I'm going to be making here. Even before you get riposte, the riposte rogue is actually a pretty good build. I actually quite like picking the riposte rogue as my first adventurer from an inn, because you can basically invest into mechanics straight away, so you can find early hidden objects, and also there is a lack of good frontline characters early on in the game. Edir exists and that's about it really, so I do think it's a very good option for your first adventurer from an inn that you hire. So the next talent is yet another defensive talent, and it's actually superior deflection. It's an extra 5 deflection, and that's it. Basically that's all that's to be said about it. Definitely worthwhile picking up. You can only actually pick this up at level 6, you can't pick it up previously. So the next ability that we're going to pick is Reckless Assault at this stage. Now this is very debatable because it lowers deflection by 8, which means we're going to get hit more often, and also the riposte talent ability, I should say, will work less often. But there is a talent associated to this that actually increases your deflection by 5. So in reality it's only really -3 if we pick that talent. It's still bad, but I think the bonuses that this gives to accuracy and melee damage actually probably just about make up for it. It's basically a math question really, whether this is worthwhile or not. You need to be attacking, doing conventional attacks a certain amount really to make up for it, and I think we'll be doing enough, put it that way. I should mention about armor at this stage as well. In this example I've got some Brigandine armor on, which is a very heavy armor type. Plate armor is only the heavier armor type I believe in the game. You will want to wear a lot of armor, but it will lower your recovery speed, which is bad. You'll be doing attacks less often because of it, but I think you just have to do that. If you weren't to wear armor with a frontline character builds, then you just be getting damaged too often. Even if your deflection was absolutely crazy, there are other ways that your character would be attacked. So yeah, you really need to wear armor, even though there is downside to recovery time. But yeah, Reckless Assault is going to be the ability I pick at that level, and I'm going to be picking Deflecting Assault for the extra 5 deflection straight away there. Right, so we're on level 9 now, so starting to get pretty deep into this character build. At this stage we actually have a huge amount of abilities to pick from. So Finishing Blow, I'm not going to be picking that, but it's not terrible. This description is pretty awful. I believe it works better the less endurance the opponent has, basically. It's not too bad. Adept Evasion, I don't think it's great. It only works against attacks that use reflex, target your reflex, and there aren't too many of those. Most of the attacks in the game target deflection. Coordinating Position I'm going to be picking later on, and Deep Wounds as well, but I'll mention more about them later. Persistent Distraction I'm going to be picking here, I think, but I'll mention more about that shortly. Actually, any one of those 3 could be a good pick at this stage. Withering Strike and Fearsome Strike are better for more conventional rogues that have higher intelligence. They're limited with Riposte Rogue because of it, so I wouldn't pick either of those. So all three of these are actually pretty good picks at this stage, and it's personal choice really. I'm going to pick Persistent Distraction. It's actually a newer ability that's been added to the game since White Match came out. This is very good for the Riposte Rogue. I might not actually pick this for a normal conventional rogue. Actually, I wouldn't recommend it because you're not going to be... Well, it kind of depends, but this definitely works better for a frontline build. So what happens is anyone who is contributing to being flanked by the rogue is also distracted, which means they have their stats lowered, as you can see there, basically defenses. Also, they lose their engagement, which is really good. Now, this really ties in with the hold the line talents that we picked earlier on. So we're actually going to be distracting more than one opponent, two, if we actually have two next to us. So using certain weapons that actually increase your levels of engagement are a very good idea as well, to distract more opponents potentially. There are some special weapons that can do that. Now, speaking of weapons, at this stage I would probably pick a weapon focus. So to be honest, whichever weapon focus you go for kind of depends what weapon you have at the time in your game. You may want to retrain your character if you get a better weapon. There are certain weapons though that you may want to consider with the Riposte Rogue. The hatchet is a very good one to start out with. That gives you extra deflection, and there are some special hatchets in the game as well. Any weapons that give you extra attack speed are going to be very good with the Riposte Rogue. You want to be attacking more often, doing more damage, so that's a definite type of weapon to go for if it gives you extra attack speed, more specialized weapons. You could go for rapiers since it goes very well with the theme of doing riposte attacks. There are actually some pretty good riposte rapiers within the game that give extra bonuses. So I think, which one does riposte come under? Rapier. Noble. Peasant is hatchet. Yeah, so it kind of depends what weapon you want to use really. Starting off with a long range weapon's a pretty good idea with the rogue, since you can basically get a sneak attack straight away and do a ton of extra damage to opponents, and then switch over to your shield and your weapon. So something like Soldier might not be too bad. Start off with an Arbalist or an Arquebus, weapons that do a lot of damage, and then just use normal conventional weapon and shields attacks for the rest of the combat. Or maybe something like a blunderbuss or a pistol could be a way to go. But in this case, since it's riposte, let's pick a rapier, is it? So we'll go noble. Not necessarily a pick I'd make though. Right, so that's done. Now moving on to level 11. So there's a couple of new abilities available at this stage. Death Blows is excellent, and I believe that's the pick I'm actually going to be making here. So when you have 2 afflictions or more that allow a sneak attack, you do a huge amount of extra damage. So that's brilliant, and this works well for all different types of rogue builds, so I will be taking that. This has been added since the White March has come out. This is much better for conventional types of rogues. You'd have higher intelligence, you need to make the most use out of it. It does, well, the distracted ability doesn't work very well with the last ability I picked either, since we're already distracting opponents, so I won't be picking that with a riposte rogue, but with a conventional rogue I would definitely recommend it. Perhaps that previous conventional rogue video I did. So pick Death Blows at this stage. And the next talent. So at this stage it becomes a question of what you want really. Most of the really good picks have been made already. Vicious Fighting goes with Dirty Fighting that we picked earlier on, so that's a good pick. Shadow and Beyond, I don't think you need it so much with this type of rogue. Backstab, if you invest highly into stealth, you could make use out of this. It's not too bad, especially with a frontline build actually. and you get crazy levels of damage. So that's definitely one you could pick here. Most of the hybrid talents that are now available with the White March since it's come out aren't great for a riposte rogue, because a lot of them make use out of intelligence. Is that there? But it's good in the might for the other stats. That needs intelligence, that needs intelligence, that needs intelligence, that's pretty useless. That would be good, but it's lack of intelligence. This doesn't need intelligence, but I don't think it's that useful. You could maybe pick that with this build. Don't think it needs intelligence, this one, but it's so late into combat it's not very useful. That wouldn't be terrible, to be honest, with the riposte rogue build. You could start off combat with a hobbled attack. Doesn't last too long though, with a gun perhaps. Veteran's recovery is actually pretty good with the riposte rogue, but it doesn't last a huge amount of time. But 30 seconds is a long time still, so I'd actually highly consider picking this with your maxed might. That's going to be very good. The other talents, wound binding is actually potentially very good for a riposte rogue. 40% to health. That duration doesn't matter with it. If you decide to pick this, you could actually, well, later on into the game you may want to retrain your riposte rogue potentially. If you're finding that he's just surviving very easily all the time, you could take some points out of constitution and stick it into your dexterity stat to attack more often, more quickly, do yet more damage. So that's a pretty good pick potentially. Deep pockets, that's a pretty decent pick. What else is there? I think I've exhausted most of the defensive picks. You may want to increase some of your defenses, like your will and maybe mental fortress could be an idea. The other types of defenses, maybe not so much. Well, maybe reflex arguably, but I think will might be the most useful out of those. I probably wouldn't recommend more than one weapon focus. Savage attack doesn't work with the riposte ability. I've tried it out, so I wouldn't recommend that. And Venom Strike's a bit weird. You can see that it mentions a base of 48, but it's 45. I don't know why that is. I haven't figured that out. I think there might be two things affecting it. I can't... Well, you'd think that with our might value it would go up, wouldn't you? But it's lowered. That's been lowered by intelligence. So that's could potentially be good, but maybe not since it's lowered. I don't want marksman or gun or anything like that. These weapon styles, now you might think that the two weapon style would be absolutely brilliant, but the problem is the larder door, for example, doesn't work with it, as shields don't work with it in the tests I've done. I'm 98% sure this won't work with it. If it did, I would definitely pick this talent. It would be brilliant if that was the case. I don't believe one-handed actually works with the ladder door either in the tests that I've done. Not quite sure about that as with that, but yeah, that might not be too bad under certain circumstances. With a normal shield I think it would work, but yeah, with a ladder door it doesn't. All of these other bonuses are against certain creature types, which you're probably not going to want to pick. Interrupting blows, you're not really attacking enough probably to make use of that. It's better for more area of effect attack styles, like Barbarian with Carnage attack probably. Vulnerable attack, you don't want to lower your attack speed. That's no good for this build. Bloody Sword is not too bad a pick though. I'd actually consider that. So I've mentioned tons of different talents. Let's actually pick one. Vicious Fighting I'll go for at this stage. Okay. Next ability. That's a new one since White March came out, but it might not be too bad, but the intelligence with our character has really weakened it a lot, so I probably wouldn't pick that. Shadow Step doesn't seem to be too good to me when I've tried it out. It might be better for a more conventional type of rogue. Even then, no, I'm not a big fan of that, to be honest. So at this stage, maybe coordinating positioning or deep wounds. So those basically are the last picks now I'd pick with the rogue. Let's pick that one, is it? Kind of depends. So let's pick that. It's good for keeping your other party members safe. You can replace them with the rogue in whatever combat they're in. The next talent pick, let's pick Veterans Recovery. This is going up every level as well, so probably just about worthwhile. Pretty decent pick. Feigned Death just doesn't work very well with this rogue type, in my opinion. I mean, they're untargetable for a while and get extra endurance, but you don't really want to be doing that with this rogue. It's more of a conventional rogue you want to use that with to get out of trouble. So at this stage I'd probably pick Deep Wounds if I hadn't already picked this. Now this is actually a very good pick. It does extra damage. Problem is it's reduced because of our lack of intelligence, but you still actually do a lot of damage with it. Not sure how much, about 8 per hit maybe. So it was better. It's better for other different types of rogues, but it's still good for this rogue type, so I would actually pick that out of all of these options, I believe. So moving on to skills, we're going to want to invest in mechanics early, more than likely. So how much you want to invest in mechanics is open to debate, at least 10 probably, maybe 12, I'm not really sure to be honest. We're going to want to invest at least a point in athletics to pick up the second wind ability. I've recently done a guide video on skills, which I recommend you check out. Athletics doesn't actually level very well late game. With late game characters that have lots of endurance, you just don't get an awful lot for each point you invest in terms of recovery for your endurance. So late game, maybe you shouldn't invest so much in athletics arguably, but maybe you could retrain your character if you'd already invest in it. It's open to debate, that is, to be honest. Yeah, definitely check out my guide video for more info on that. Apart from that, you definitely want to invest a certain amount in stealth. Survival, this really comes down to which is your preference, what you like to use here. There's a lot of things here which are very useful for the Riposte rogue. The extra received healing multiplier is very useful. The accuracy against creature type is very useful. If you're using a lot of potions, which is a good idea for extra deflection with the Riposte rogue, you may want to invest 5 points into survival. You can always use equipment, of course. There are a number of equipment items that give you extra points for certain skills. That one for flanking is also pretty good for the Riposte rogue. So how much you want to invest here is very, very open to debate. It's kind of what you fancy going for in the main. So you could go for something along those lines perhaps, or you could knock some points off survival and stick a couple more into mechanics, more into athletics, more into stealth. It's really whatever you fancy, really. So the last talent now. I think for the last talent, it's kind of comes down to whether or not we want to start with a ranged weapon or just want to always use melee weapons. So if you wanted to maybe start with a ranged weapon, something like this pick here, Runner's Wounding Shot, would be a pretty good way to start out, hobble your opponents. If you want to always use melee weapons, then starting combat with the Backstab would be a pretty good idea. You could invest more into stealth, perhaps get 2 meters away, and then either, well, use a melee weapon to hit your opponent really, really powerfully. I could in theory use a blunderbuss at 2 meters away, something like that, if you really wanted to. It's not a terrible idea either, certainly not. So I think we'll take Backstab as our last talent pick. If you're not going to use a gun, you can have a couple of one-handed weapons in each hand, perhaps, as your secondary weapon option. So before I end the video, let's see the Riposte rogue in action. This Riposte rogue I haven't actually retrained, so I would actually put more into Dex, probably taking bits from Perception and maybe a bit from Constitution. Since we have extra accuracy from the abilities and talents we've picked, then maybe we don't need so much. That's how much health and endurance you would get if you had 18 Constitution by the end of the game. Now I've used a cheat code basically to level this guy up, so we don't have the equipment that I would normally have at level 16 here, so his deflection isn't as much as it would be. I've only got an extra 5 deflection from that, and that's about it. You could of course get tons more deflection than this, but should suffice for a combat example here. So let's start out with combat. We'll use the blend arquebus in this case, so you can use blinded strike there and do a huge amount of damage. So she is blinded, did the sneak attack, we do deep wounds on top of that as well. Then you could switch on reckless assault, which you probably wouldn't start out with on in combat, otherwise you'd lose deflection. It only works in melee, so not ranged. So you stick that on there, you switch your weapon over, and you close in for the action then, and start doing huge amounts of damage. Get the deep wounds every attack, and you alternate between
and I'm taking it away.
shield, lavador, and the weapon you're happening to use. Let's actually see the riposte in action, so hopefully she's going to miss and we triggered at 20% here.
Let's talk this over.
There we go. So on that attack there, she was riposted. She missed and we hit the 20% chance. So the riposte rogue did 25% pierce damage. He's just got a exceptional rapier in his hand. There's a lot better weapons than that. So a lot of damage was done there. We did the deep wounds as well. And also the ladder also worked, so it bashed her. Did 5 crush damage. It wasn't a critical, sadly. Was that a critical? Yes, it was. And we get deep wounds for the ladder as well as that attack. So all in all, you're going to be doing a heck of a lot of damage, and not every opponent will have as much armor as she does. So that concludes this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please help me out by giving this video a like. I'm really grateful to those of you who do that, as it helps improve my videos in YouTube's search rankings so people can actually find them in the first place. If you have any comments or questions about this video, if you want to know about something in more detail, or you want to request future content, please let me know by using the comment section. And if you like this content, please consider subscribing as well. Check out my playlist for Pillars of Eternity. There's plenty more content in there that may interest you. Check out my homepage as well for the channel. There's plenty of Let's Plays and guide videos for not only Pillars of Eternity, but plenty of other games as well. And also I have a Patreon page. If you want to see the channel survive and thrive and do well, then even the smallest of donations, whether it's one-off or every month, massively helps at the channel. I really need the help to keep the channel going. So I'm really grateful to those of you who check out my Patreon page, and especially those of you who actually decide to help out by donating. Right, so I believe that's it. Thank you for watching again, and I'll see you next time.